Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk hums with the sound of ventilators and the sharp smell of antiseptic that never quite fades, no matter how many 12-hour shifts pass through these corridors. Katie Rodriguez moves through the emergency department like a shadow on her third month, speaking only when necessary, her hand steady despite the tremor that wakes her at 3 in the morning. She carries coffee in a chipped mug, wears scrubs 2 sizes too large, keeps her hair pulled back so tight it stretches the skin at her temples. The ER doesn't ask questions about the past. The ER doesn't ask anything at all. The shift change happens at 7 in the morning. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Katie checks the assignment board without looking at anyone's face, noting which beds need stocking, which patients need vitals, which monitors are due for replacement batteries. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in plastic. She moves to Station C and begins arranging supplies with the precision of someone who has done this motion 10,000 times before, each item placed exactly where her hands expect it to be. A trauma alert sounds through the intercom at 7:42. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. Hit and run, male victim, no identification. The stretcher wheels squeak down the corridor like a warning siren. Katie steps back, making space. The paramedics wheel in a man who looks to be in his mid-50s, unconscious, his face a map of contusions and lacerations. His left leg is swollen to twice its normal size. What catches Katie's attention is what he's holding, a pair of worn combat boots, clutched against his chest like a life preserver. Not new. Not regulation. Old enough that the leather has cracked along the creases, scuffed at the heels, the sole worn thin. The boots of someone who walked miles in desert heat. In Kandahar heat. Her hands pause. Just for a moment. Just long enough that someone observant might have noticed. Dr. Marcus Sterling enters the trauma bay at 7:45, and the room's energy shifts like a pressure change before a storm. He is 48 years old, moves with the confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered, and he carries himself as if every person in the room exists to assist him. His white coat is pressed to a knife edge. His watch costs more than Katie's car. He scans the unconscious patient with clinical efficiency, then his eyes move across the room, landing on Katie for exactly 2 seconds. What Dr. Sterling saw, a timid nurse with downcast eyes, shoulders slightly hunched forward, hair pulled back without style or intention, scrubs that hang on her frame like they belong to someone else. He saw someone who flinched slightly when the trauma alert sounded. Someone who stepped back instead of forward. Someone who would not last the month. What he did not see, the surgical scars running up Katie's forearms, hidden now by the rolled cuffs of her sleeves, scars that came from shrapnel in a place that didn't exist on most maps. He did not see the steady hands that had performed emergency procedures in the dark without morphine or anesthesia. He did not see the legend. Rodriguez. His voice carries the weight of authority and nothing else. Get me the airway cart. Katie moves without hesitation. The airway cart is 3 bays over. She retrieves it in 47 seconds and positions it exactly where a trauma surgeon needs it, the wheels locking, the height adjusted without being asked. Her hands know this. Her muscle memory knows this. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The patient's oxygen saturation is dropping. 92. 89. The monitor sounds its alarm, a steady beeping that accelerates in rhythm with the crisis. Dr. Sterling looks at the resident standing nearest to him, a young doctor who has trained for 7 years but has maybe performed this procedure a dozen times outside of simulation. Sterling steps back. This is the resident's moment to lead. The resident's moment to prove himself. The resident's hand shakes slightly as he reaches for the tube. Katie watches the oxygen saturation drop to 84. 82. The airway is compromised. The positioning is wrong. She can see it in the angle of the head, the approach the resident is taking. He's going to waste 30 seconds that don't exist. She watches him try once. Fail. Try again. His movements are precise but slow, and slow is death in an airway emergency. 78% oxygen saturation. The room is not silent. The monitor is beeping. The ventilator at the next bay is recycling its mechanical rhythm. A code cart is rolling past in the hallway. But inside Katie's chest, there is a kind of silence that comes only from certainty. She steps forward. One step. Her arm extends. She does not ask. She does not wait for permission. Her fingers take the laryngoscope from the resident's hand with the gentleness of someone removing a knife from a suicide attempt, and her voice comes out low and steady, carrying the unmistakable weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Step back. The resident steps back. Katie's hands move on their own. The scope goes in with surgical precision. The tube follows at an angle that opens the airway into alignment. The syringe that secures the tube is operated by someone who has done this not a dozen times but hundreds of times. The whole procedure takes 19 seconds. The monitor's beep transforms from a descending alarm into a steady rhythm. Oxygen saturation climbs. 85. 90. 95. 100%. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The silence in the trauma bay lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Sterling's eyes narrow. He looks at Katie, really looks at her for the first time, and what he sees is not a timid nurse but something else entirely. Something that contradicts everything his initial assessment had concluded. His jaw tightens. He turns away without comment and checks the patient's other vitals as if the last 30 seconds did not happen at all. Katie steps back to her original position near the wall. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is even. She does not make eye contact with anyone. The resident stares at her with an expression somewhere between gratitude and confusion. A nurse named Patricia, who has worked at Sacred Heart for 4 years, raises her eyebrows slightly but says nothing. What happens in trauma bays stays in trauma bays. This is the rule. The patient, John Doe, no identification, nothing but the combat boots clutched against his chest, is moved to intensive care at 8:14. Katie does not follow. She returns to her station and continues her shift as if the last 40 minutes did not happen at all, as if her hands did not just remember who they belong to, as if the muscle memory she has spent 3 months trying to forget did not just wake up and take over like an old instinct. The rest of the morning passes. Vitals checks. For lines. Medication administration. Small talk with other nurses about nothing important. At noon, the lunch rush begins in the cafeteria. Katie sits alone at a table in the corner, a turkey sandwich that she does not really want, coffee in her chipped mug, her mind somewhere else entirely. The fluorescent lights buzz above her. Rain begins to fall against the windows, hammering the glass like applause. Dr. Sterling enters the cafeteria at 12:34. He is not alone. He is surrounded by residents and attending physicians, the inner circle of the hospital's surgical hierarchy, people whose opinions matter and whose careers benefit from his favor. He surveys the cafeteria with the expression of a general surveying a battlefield. His eyes find Katie immediately. They lock on her table. She does not look up from her sandwich. He changes direction. He walks toward her table with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who has decided something. His entourage follows like a congregation. The cafeteria noise does not decrease, but somehow the room becomes aware of what is about to happen. Pressure changes. The air itself seems to shift. Katie looks up when his shadow falls across her food. "I've been here for 8 years," Dr. Sterling says. His voice is loud enough that everyone within 20 feet can hear him clearly. "And I've never seen a nurse fail faster than Rodriguez here is about to." He pauses. He smiles. It is not a kind smile. "In fact, I'm going to make a little bet with anyone interested. This one quits within a week. 7 days, maximum." She doesn't have the spine for it. Katie sets her sandwich down on the plastic plate. She does not speak. She waits. "So here's what I think." Dr. Sterling reaches down and takes her lunch tray by the edge. I think you should try something harder to eat, sweetheart. Something with a little more substance. He lifts the tray and rotates it in one smooth motion, dumping the contents onto the floor. The sandwich lands on the tile first, followed by the coffee mug, which shatters into 4 pieces. The coffee spreads across the floor like a stain. The room goes dead silent. Katie's eyes move from the spilled food to Dr. Sterling's face. Her jaw clench. Just once. Just enough that a trained observer would notice. The trembling in her hands is not fear. It is restraint. It is the sound of every protocol, every rule, every hard-won decision to stay quiet and invisible and safe suddenly pressing up against the inside of her ribs like something trying to escape. She takes one measured breath. She lets a single tear escape from her right eye, and she wipes it away without breaking eye contact. Her voice comes out quiet and steady, carrying the kind of calm that comes only from having already survived the worst. Your hands are shaking, Doctor. Perhaps you should sit down before you hurt someone. Dr. Sterling's smile falters. It is a small thing, but it is there. He was not expecting resistance. He was expecting tears and apologies and capitulation. Instead, he got steel wrapped in silk, and something about it makes his jaw clench in return. He walks away without responding, his entourage trailing behind him. The cafeteria slowly returns to its normal volume. Katie kneels down and begins cleaning up the spilled coffee with paper towels from a dispenser on the wall. No one helps her. No one stops to check if she is okay. This is how small betrayals work in hospitals. This is how invisible people stay invisible. What Dr. Sterling didn't know was that Katie Rodriguez had voluntarily walked away from a career as a decorated senior chief petty officer after PTSD from Kandahar became unbearable, choosing anonymity at a quiet civilian hospital to heal in peace, telling no one, not even her adult daughter, where she had gone or who she had been. The charts hit the floor like artillery fire. 5 manila folders scattered across the corridor tile, patient records fanning across white linoleum in front of 4 residents and an attending physician. Katie froze mid-step, her hand still extended toward the last folder. Dr. Sterling stood 3 feet away, his posture radiating the kind of casual cruelty that comes from knowing no one would stop him. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping condescension like honey over broken glass. The residents shifted. Eyes found the ceiling. One woman studied her shoes with the intensity of someone reading scripture. The attending physician's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a betrayal. In that suspended moment, Katie understood something essential: silence from witnesses was permission. Neutrality was complicity. She took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, that constant drone that never stopped, that only the exhausted could hear. Her fingers curled and uncurled against her scrub pockets. She was aware of every detail, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something human underneath, the weight of 3 pairs of eyes refusing to look at her, the way Sterling's pupils dilated slightly, anticipating her breakdown the way a predator anticipates weakness. A single tear escaped. She felt it before she saw it, a traitorous bead of salt sliding down her left cheekbone. For a moment, the mask cracked. For a moment, the timid little nurse was visible, the woman who'd just started 3 months ago, who still apologized when residents bumped into her, who took the long way around the ER to avoid Dr. Sterling's rotation. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice emerged differently. Not louder. Lower. The timbre shifted, the cadence changed, something ancient and precise surfaced beneath the civilian veneer. Your hands are shaking, Doctor. Perhaps you should sit down before you hurt someone. The words hung in the corridor air like a held breath. Sterling's face flushed crimson, the flush spreading up his neck in splotches. His jaw clenched so hard his temporalis muscle flexed visibly. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The residents watched, stunned into silence by something they couldn't quite name, not the words themselves, but the authority in them. The absolute certainty. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Sterling turned sharply and strode away, his gait rigid, his shoulders rigid, his entire presence compressed into something smaller than it had been seconds before. The attending paused at the end of the hallway. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge her. But his footsteps slowed for just a moment, recognition, maybe, or the dawning realization that he'd made a choice. Then he kept walking. Katie knelt and gathered the scattered charts, her movements deliberate and unhurried. One resident bent to help. Katie looked at her, a woman named Dr. Chen, maybe 30, with kind eyes that were now radiating something like guilt. "I've got it," Katie said quietly. Chen straightened, hesitated, then walked away. The charts were crisp against her palms. Patient names. Medical histories. The weight of responsibility that nobody acknowledged because it came from a woman in scrubs making half what the residents made. She stacked them into a neat pile, stood, and continued her rounds as if the corridor hadn't just witnessed something that would ripple through the hospital's hierarchy in ways Sterling didn't understand yet. What he didn't understand was that he'd just made a mistake. That afternoon, Katie was checking on John Doe's vitals when she felt someone watching her. Not the casual attention of a patient or nurse. Something sharper. She turned to find the Army Ranger 3 doors down, a man with a leg cast and a face that had seen things that couldn't be unseen. His name was Holloway. He'd been admitted 5 days ago with a compound fracture from a motorcycle accident. He studied her with the intensity of someone working through a puzzle. When she passed his doorway, he called out quietly, "Hey, nurse. Hold up a second." Katie stopped. She didn't approach his room. She stood in the doorway, maintaining distance, maintaining the professional boundary that separated her from the rest of the hospital. "Everything okay? Do you need pain medication?" "I watched you yesterday," Holloway said. His voice was the texture of gravel, the voice of someone who'd spent years shouting over helicopter rotors. "In the ER. The airway procedure on the trauma incoming. That wasn't standard protocol. That was combat medicine. You were a medic." Katie's spine stiffened. The world tilted slightly. In the distance, a monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm, steady, predictable, alive. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was the careful, neutral tone she'd cultivated over 3 months. "I'm a nurse, Mr. Holloway." "Yeah," he said quietly. "You are. Now." She left without responding, her jaw working, her hand steady even as something inside her chest constricted like a fist. She finished her shift on autopilot, vitals, medications, documentation, the endless rotation of care that required precision but not presence. By the time she clocked out at 11 p.m., her mind had already constructed 17 different explanations for what Holloway had seen, and discarded all of them. That night in her car, Katie gripped the steering wheel for 20 minutes without turning the key. Her hands were white-knuckled against the worn leather. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, just her car and 2 others under the fluorescent lights that cast everything in shades of gray. Her phone buzzed. Her daughter. A text, "You okay? You're never this late." Katie didn't respond. She couldn't find words that made sense. How do you explain that the quiet life you built was developing fault lines? How do you tell your daughter, the one you'd left without explanation, told you were taking a position downstate, promised you'd call more often, that someone had seen through the disguise in less than 3 months? She started the engine and drove home in silence. The strategic campaign began the next morning in a way that was almost elegant in its cruelty. Dr. Sterling didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or condescend. He made phone calls. He opened files. He weaponized procedure and policy like a surgeon wielding instruments. First, he requested Katie's employment file from HR. It was sparse, just as he expected. 3 months at Sacred Heart. Before that, a gap spanning approximately 18 months with no explanation. References from 2 supervisors at a clinic in Seattle she'd left without notice. Nothing in her resume about prior experience. Nothing about education beyond her nursing degree. Nothing that explained where a woman with surgical-level precision had come from or why she'd arrived at Sacred Heart with minimal credentials. He made his first call Tuesday morning to Supervisor Chen's boss, framing his concerns with the precision of someone who understood institutional politics. Patient safety issue, he'd said. Procedural irregularities. Someone without proper training performing advanced interventions. I'm not comfortable with liability implications. By Wednesday, he'd escalated. A call to a board member named Carver, a man who owed Sterling 3 referrals worth approximately $200,000 in private practice revenue. Sterling's pitch was simple: we might have undertrained staff operating above scope. Could become a liability. By Thursday, he'd filed a formal competency review request, citing patient safety concerns and recommending a board-supervised evaluation before Katie was permitted to work unsupervised in any clinical capacity. Katie learned about the review on a Tuesday morning, 7 days after the hallway incident with Holloway. HR Supervisor Morris slid the paperwork across her desk with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for explosive devices. The folder was 3 inches thick, filled with Sterling's documentation, his observation reports, his competency concerns, his recommendations, his references. It's routine, Morris said, avoiding eye contact in a way that suggested anything but routine. Just a formality. Katie read the entire packet in silence. Sterling's handwriting was precise and clinical. He documented the emergency airway procedure from 2 weeks ago, noting advanced techniques not standard for registered nursing. He'd cited her sparse employment history as a potential indicator of inadequate training. He'd recommended a formal skills assessment and temporary restriction from certain clinical areas. He'd been thorough. He'd been careful. He'd been weaponized. Katie signed the paperwork without argument, her signature steady, her hand moving across the page like it was performing a procedure she'd done 1,000 times. Because it had. Paperwork and bureaucracy and administrative warfare, this was just a different kind of combat, with different weapons. That evening, during her shift, she found herself standing in the doorway of John Doe's room. The patient was still unconscious, still on the ventilator, still an absolute mystery. But someone had placed his combat boots on the bedside table, the leather cracked and faded, clearly decades old, held together more by muscle memory than structural integrity. They were the kind of boots that had walked through deserts. The kind that had survived things their owner hadn't yet survived. Katie didn't touch them. She looked at them the way a soldier might look at an artifact from a war she'd already fought. The boots sat there like a question she wasn't ready to answer, like a mirror reflecting something she'd spent 18 months trying to forget. She finished her rounds and went home to a daughter who was learning to live with a mother made of secrets. The Army Ranger patient found her at the corridor's edge, near the supply closet where the night staff kept the crash cart. His arm was still bandaged from the infection that had nearly taken it 3 weeks ago. He moved like someone rebuilding himself one careful step at a time, and his eyes carried the unmistakable weight of someone who'd seen combat zones transform into something worse than any battlefield, the knowledge that your body might betray you before your enemies ever could. That airway procedure yesterday, he said quietly, his voice low enough that the nurses at the station 30 feet away wouldn't hear. I watched you do it from the doorway. You were a medic. It wasn't a question. The certainty in his voice made it a statement of fact, delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent years reading combat situations in microseconds. Katie's hand stilled. She'd been adjusting the 4-line on room for 12, a routine task that her hands could perform while her mind wandered. Now her hand stopped entirely. I don't know what you mean, she said, but the words landed flat between them like something already dead. I served with people like you. I know the difference between someone who learned medicine from a textbook and someone who learned it because the alternative was watching people die. He paused, and she could feel him studying her profile. You moved like someone who'd done field surgery under fire. I was in Kandahar. 2 tours. I know what that looks like. The fluorescent lights above them seemed to hum louder than they had a moment before. Katie turned to face him fully, her expression unchanged, her jaw set at the same neutral angle it had been before. But something inside her had fractured like old concrete under weight, clean, sharp, irreversible. 18 months. 18 months of muted scrubs, of keeping her head down, of letting the timid nurse persona become so complete that even her own daughter had stopped asking questions. She'd built an entire architecture of forgetting, and now a 32-year-old Army Ranger with a healing arm had dismantled it in 7 sentences. "You should rest," she said. "Your arm needs elevation." "That's not an answer." "No," Katie agreed. "It's not." She turned back to the 4 line, and the ranger, his name was Mitchell, she remembered now, from the patient board, didn't push further. But he'd already said what mattered. He'd seen her. And that seeing, that recognition of what she was beneath the scrubs and the nervous habits and the carefully cultivated invisibility, would become the thread that unraveled everything. The shift continued like it always did. She moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to occupy space without being seen, to be present without being present. Room 307 needed their pain medications refilled. Room for 10 needed new dressings. The supply closet needed organizing. Normal work. Ordinary rhythm. Except nothing felt ordinary anymore, because the secret, the thing she'd kept sealed away like shrapnel in a wound that had finally closed, was now visible to someone else. At 2:17 a.m., John Doe's monitor began to scream. The alarm cut through the night shift like a siren, that peculiar rhythmic shriek that every cardiac monitor in Sacred Heart used to announce catastrophe. Katie was at the nurse's station, documenting a medication administration, when the second alert came through. Room 318. The John Doe patient. His oxygen saturation was dropping. She was moving before conscious thought caught up to her body. The doors to 318 swung open as she entered, and the scene that met her was the kind of clinical chaos that most nurses encountered only in simulation training. The ventilator was cycling, pushing oxygen into lungs that couldn't absorb it. The monitor display showed oxygen saturation plummeting 88, 84, 79. The numbers falling like a counter on a bomb nobody knew how to disarm. John Doe's breathing was asymmetrical. His chest wall on the left side was hyperresonant. She could see the way it sat wrong, bulging slightly outward, hyperinflated and hard. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, pushing on his lung, compressing it toward the center of his chest cavity. The pressure building with every breath the ventilator forced in. The clinical picture was unmistakable to anyone with the training to read it, and Katie's training was written in 18 years of service across 3 continents. The on-call resident, Dr. Paulson, arrived at the bedside 30 seconds after the alarm had started, his stethoscope still half around his neck, his face the particular shade of pale that came from being woken at 2:17 a.m. and told that a patient was crashing. "Get me a chest X-ray," he said, his voice uncertain. "We need to confirm." "There's no time," Katie said. The words came out low, authoritative, stripped of the deference she'd been wearing like borrowed clothes. He's in respiratory distress from a pneumothorax. The pressure's collapsing his lung. "We need a needle decompression now." Paulson turned to look at her, and she could see the moment his medical training collided with his institutional awareness that a nurse shouldn't be diagnosing conditions or telling him what procedures were necessary. But his eyes flicked back to the monitor, 77, 74, 71, and the clinical reality overrode his objections. "Call the attending," he said, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone watching a situation spiral beyond their competence. Katie was already moving. She'd prepped the decompression kit before the resident had finished speaking, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind that could pierce through chest wall muscle and fascia with the kind of speed that meant the difference between a patient who'd wake up and a patient who wouldn't. Her hands found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the landmark where the needle needed to go. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers located the anatomical landmarks with the same muscle memory that let a pianist find middle C in the dark, and then she positioned the needle. The hiss of air came immediately, that particular rushing sound of pressure release, of a pneumothorax decompressing back into the atmosphere where it belonged. The catheter threaded through, securing the pathway. John Doe's chest wall deflated slightly, the tense hyperresonance releasing, his lung expanding back toward normal position. The monitor responded. 93, 95. 97. The oxygen saturation climbed like an elevator to safety. The alarm that had been screaming ceased its rhythm. John Doe's breathing became bilateral, symmetrical, his chest wall moving in matched patterns again. The clinical picture shifted from catastrophic collapse to stable crisis in the space of perhaps 90 seconds. Dr. Paulson stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his hand still positioned as though he'd been preparing to take action at the exact moment action had become unnecessary. He stared at the monitor, then at the needle in John Doe's chest, then at Katie, who was already documenting vital signs and oxygen saturation trends with the precise notation of someone who'd written similar observations thousands of times before. "That's not your scope of practice," Paulson said finally, his voice carrying the particular defensiveness of someone who'd just watched a nurse perform a procedure that was, technically, well outside the boundaries of nursing licensure. "I'm calling the attending." Katie didn't respond. She finished her documentation, secured the needle decompression kit, and stepped back from the bedside. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were trembling, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the particular aftershock that came when adrenaline flooded a system that had spent too long in civilian peacetime. Pain was information. Trembling hands were data. Her nervous system was telling her what her mind already understood. She'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, revealed a capability that had been hidden beneath carefully maintained layers of professional deference. The attending arrived within 20 minutes, examined John Doe, reviewed the chest X-ray that Paulson had finally ordered, and confirmed what Katie had assessed in the dark: tension pneumothorax, treated correctly, complication prevented. He nodded at Katie with the kind of respect that sometimes passed between experienced medical professionals, the nod that said, "I see what you did there, and I don't know what your training was, but I know what effective looks like." Then he was gone again, returning to whatever sleep he'd been pulled from. But that wasn't the worst part. Because Dr. Sterling, who ran rounds at 6 a.m., who made his decisions based on information that flowed through channels of institutional authority and alliance, would have a full report by the time the sun came up. A nurse had performed a needle decompression without an order. A nurse had diagnosed a tension pneumothorax. A nurse had stepped outside her lane, exceeded her scope, violated the hierarchies that kept hospitals functioning according to the rules that doctors made and nurses followed. By Friday afternoon, when Katie was called to the HR office and told that she was suspended pending investigation, effective immediately, she understood that Sterling had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. She'd given him the ammunition. She'd revealed enough of herself to let him shoot. The security guard who escorted her from the building didn't meet her eyes. That was almost the kindest thing about it, that he had the decency to be uncomfortable with his role in removing her. Katie carried a cardboard box containing the few personal items from her locker, a photograph of her daughter, a pen, a water bottle. She walked past Dr. Sterling's office on the second floor and saw him standing in the doorway, arms crossed, that thin smile on his face like a predator that had finally found a way to sink its teeth into something it had been circling for months. She didn't slow. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply passed, and moved toward the exit, and let the doors close behind her on a life she'd been trying very hard to pretend she still wanted to keep. The ER doors clicked shut behind Dr. Sterling as he watched the needle slide into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. The monitor climbing. 78. 85. 92. And Katie Rodriguez, the timid little nurse he'd dumped lunch trays for, the one trembling under pressure, the one who'd flinch at his voice, didn't hesitate. Didn't fumble. Moved like someone who'd done this in conditions that would have broken normal people. His jaw tightened. He saw it all in that moment. He saw the muscle memory. He saw the precision. He saw opportunity. Within 6 hours, Sterling had made 3 phone calls. The first was to Harold Fenton, Chief of Medical Staff, who owed him $47,000 in referral fees from last fiscal year. She performed an advanced airway procedure without a resident present. Clear scope violation. I have witnesses. The second call went to board member Patricia Vance, whose daughter Sterling had fast-tracked through orthopedic residency interviews. I'm filing a formal complaint. Exceeding scope of practice. Creating liability exposure for the hospital. The third call was to someone in human resources, someone who didn't ask questions when Sterling needed files reviewed quietly. That afternoon, Sterling pulled Katie's personnel file. It was thinner than most, 3 years at Sacred Heart, no certifications beyond standard RN requirements, sparse references. One listed only a first name, Michael. No phone number. No title. No context. The other reference was from a clinic in Bethesda that had closed in 2019. A nurse who wanted to disappear had left very few breadcrumbs. Sterling smiled. Breadcrumbs could be made to look like a trail. By Thursday morning, an outside hospital investigator named Marcus Webb arrived with a leather briefcase and a mandate to determine whether Katie Rodriguez represented a liability to Sacred Heart's operations. Webb was thorough, the kind of investigator who built cases brick by brick, who documented everything, who understood that institutional protection meant paperwork trails that couldn't be challenged. Sterling walked him through the airway management, the needle decompression, the violations. Webb listened, took notes, asked questions with the precision of someone assembling evidence for a legal file. The investigator spent 12 hours at Sacred Heart. He reviewed protocols. He interviewed 3 residents who'd witnessed the needle decompression, each reporting the same clinical observation. Rodriguez had moved like a trauma surgeon, not a bedside nurse. He requested her educational records. He called Bethesda. He noted the dates. The gaps. The absence of explanation for a 3-year disappearance from any professional network or continuing education registry. By Friday morning, the decision was made. Sterling watched from the hallway as 2 security officers escorted Katie from the building at 8:48 a.m. Her badge was already deactivated. Her access codes revoked. She carried a cardboard box holding a framed photo, a stethoscope, and the trauma shears she kept in her pocket, the ones with her call sign engraved on the handle in letters so small only someone who knew what to look for would notice. Sterling stood with his arms crossed, watching her walk toward the exit, his thin smile barely contained. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply passed, and moved toward the exit, and let the doors close behind her on a life she'd been trying very hard to pretend she still wanted to keep. The house was silent when Katie got home. 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical rhythm. The front door clicked shut behind her, and for 17 seconds, she stood in the foyer still wearing her scrubs, the ones with the bloodstain on the left cuff from the needle decompression, from saving a man whose identity she didn't know, who'd clutched combat boots to his chest like they were the only thing holding him to this world. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the kind of trembling that comes from holding everything together until the moment you don't have to anymore. She moved to the kitchen table and sat down. The cardboard box went beside her. She didn't open it. She stared at nothing and let herself collapse in the way she hadn't been able to do for 3 years, the way soldiers collapse when they finally believe the mission is over and they didn't die and now there's nothing left to do except survive the living part. The coffee from the morning was still in a mug. Cold. She wrapped her hands around it anyway because her hands needed something to hold. At 3:31 p.m., the front door opened. Footsteps. Her daughter Emma's backpack hitting the tile floor. "Mom." Emma called out. Then louder, "Mom, are you here?" The confusion in her voice before she rounded the corner and saw her mother sitting at the kitchen table, mascara streaked, eyes red, still in hospital scrubs on a Wednesday afternoon when she should have been running rounds. Emma's voice changed. "Why are you home early?" Katie opened her mouth. Closed it. The suspension letter was sitting on the counter behind her, the hospital letterhead visible from across the room. Clinical language. Terminated pending review. Failure to adhere to scope of practice parameters. Investigation finding of unauthorized medical procedures. The words felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "I lost my job," Katie heard herself say. Emma sat down slowly, her college textbooks forgotten in her backpack by the door. "What? Why? What happened?" Katie couldn't answer. Not in a way that made sense. Not without explaining Kandahar. Not without admitting that a man with Army Ranger credentials had come through the ER unconscious and something in her had recognized him the way a homing pigeon recognizes magnetic north, and when he'd crashed 2 days later and the on-call resident had frozen, every instinct she'd spent 3 years trying to bury had risen up and taken over her hands like they belonged to someone else, someone from before, someone she'd promised herself she'd never be again. "I made a mistake," Katie said finally. "At work. I did something I wasn't supposed to do." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's cold hand. "You saved someone, didn't you?" Katie didn't answer. But her daughter was 18 and smart and had watched her mother move through the world like someone carrying invisible weight, and Emma knew her well enough to understand that Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, though she didn't know that rank, didn't know that name had ever been anything other than Katie the nurse, had made a choice between following protocol and letting someone die, and Katie had chosen the person. That night, Katie lay awake in the dark. The house creaked with the sound of settling wood and her daughter's breathing down the hall. Rain hammered the windows like someone demanding to be let in. The suspension letter sat on the counter, final and clinical, the kind of document that said your life had been examined and found wanting in 27 bullet points. She'd built this life carefully. 3 years of being nobody. 3 years of scrubs and double shifts and learning to sleep without waking to the smell of diesel and blood. 3 years of teaching herself that she was just a nurse, just a person with a broken past and a present constructed to be so small and so ordinary that no one would ever ask her who she used to be. 48 hours ago, someone had asked. Not with words. With a combat badge. With recognition in the eyes of an Army Ranger who knew what she was because he was the same thing. 5 days passed. Rain came and went. Emma tried to help, brought her mother coffee, asked careful questions that Katie couldn't quite answer. The suspension letter was joined by others, an investigator's report, a list of policy violations, a timeline of her employment at Sacred Heart that suddenly looked like a series of infractions waiting to happen. On the 6th day, Katie returned to the hospital to collect the rest of her belongings. Emma insisted on coming with her, insisted on walking beside her mother through the glass doors of Sacred Heart, past the reception desk where the secretary's eyes widened and then carefully looked away. The ER smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of air recycled through 100 mechanical systems. Nobody made eye contact. Nurses she'd worked with for 3 years suddenly found urgent tasks that required their complete attention. Katie moved through the hallway toward the locker room, Emma close beside her, when something made her stop. John Doe's room. The door was half open. The patient inside was awake, actually awake, breathing on his own, monitors showing rhythm instead of crisis. And on the bedside table sat a pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan. Scuffed. The kind that had walked through mountains that had names she wasn't supposed to remember. She stepped into the doorway. Tucked inside one boot, visible even from 6 feet away, was a faded Ranger tab and a combat badge. Not a standard military insignia. Not anything you saw in civilian hospitals. The kind of badge issued only to the people who worked in classified spaces, whose operations were redacted from public records, whose names got buried in paperwork that never left secure facilities. Katie's breath caught. The cardboard box in her hand suddenly weighed nothing. The patient's eyes opened. Focused. Found her face in the doorway with the kind of immediate clarity that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, this angle of light, this specific pair of eyes to appear in his field of vision. He whispered one word. Valkyrie. The call sign moved through Katie like electricity. 3 years. 3 years of not hearing that name spoken aloud. 3 years of being someone else. 3 years of believing that woman, the one who'd carried wounded Marines through Kandahar mountains, who'd made impossible decisions under fire, whose hands had learned to do things that changed people forever, was dead. Emma stepped forward. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, her daughter said quietly, and Katie realized that Emma had understood something crucial while standing in that kitchen watching her mother cry, that her mother carried a weight that wasn't ordinary sadness, that the mistake at the hospital had been an act of recognition, that Katie had saved someone because she knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from shared experience, that this man was the kind of person worth breaking protocol for. The SEAL liaison emerged from the corner, a man Katie hadn't noticed, which was the point of SEAL liaisons, to be the kind of invisible that only operators could achieve. He held a file that looked identical to every other classified file she'd ever seen, which meant it contained information that wasn't supposed to exist in any civilian database. His hands trembled as he opened it. Rodriguez, Catherine M., he read, voice shaking. Navy Corpsman, Fleet Marine Force. 2 silver stars. He paused. His jaw tightened. 3 bronze stars with Valor. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy. Purposeful. The kind of footsteps that belong to people who moved through spaces expecting everything to reorganize around them. A Pentagon official appeared in a dress uniform that looked like it had been pressed with surgical precision. 2 federal agents flanked him. The crowd had started gathering, residents, nurses, security, people emerging from break rooms because something had shifted in the air, some invisible pressure change that signaled that something important was about to be said out loud. Navy Cross, the official said. Each word was distinct. Carved. Actions in Kandahar, 2019. 18 Marines extracted under fire. For enemy combatants neutralized while providing combat medical care. Emma was crying. Katie realized her daughter had understood in that moment that her mother wasn't just a nurse who'd made a mistake. Her mother was someone who'd carried weight that had nothing to do with hospital protocols or civilian expectations. Call sign Valkyrie, the SEAL liaison continued. Medical Advisor, Joint Special Operations Command. Dr. Sterling appeared at the edge of the crowd. Katie saw him. Saw his face drain of color. Saw his mouth open and close without sound, the way people's mouths worked when their understanding of reality was being rewritten in real time. The Pentagon official turned to face him directly. This patient is Lieutenant Colonel James Garrett, Army Ranger, currently assigned to a Federal Protection Detail. His combat badge triggered a classified investigation 6 days ago when hospital records were uploaded to the state medical database. The FBI agent stepped forward, her voice flat and authoritative. Dr. Sterling, you are under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation and falsification of medical records. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Katie walked through the corridor she'd walked 1,000 times, her cardboard box held against her chest like armor. 3 days of suspension. 72 hours of her daughter asking questions she couldn't answer. 72 hours of rain hammering the kitchen window while her carefully constructed life disintegrated in real time. She'd come back to Sacred Heart on a Wednesday afternoon, the place emptier than usual, most staff absorbed in their routines 3 floors above. She wasn't supposed to be here. The suspension paperwork made that clear. But she had 6 years of personal items scattered across a locker in the break room, and those items were hers. The path to the break room took her past the ICU. Past John Doe's room. She didn't plan to look inside. Didn't plan to stop. But something made her pause at the doorway, her box pressed tighter against her ribs. The room was dim, monitors casting their pale blue glow across the unconscious man's face. And there, on the bedside table, someone had placed a pair of boots. Not hospital-issue footwear. Combat boots. Weathered. The leather cracked like an old map. The laces tied in a specific way, a military style, not civilian. Katie had seen boots like those before. She'd worn boots like those before. Her feet moved without permission. 3 steps. The box lowered to her side. Her eyes fixed on those boots with the kind of focus that made everything else disappear, the monitors, the fluorescent lights, the sound of the ventilator breathing for the man who lay unconscious beneath the thin hospital blanket. The boots were positioned carefully. Intentionally. Someone had placed them there knowing exactly what they meant. Katie's hand reached out. She couldn't stop it. Her fingers brushed the worn leather, and she leaned closer, peering inside the right boot. There, tucked into the toe, was a patch of faded fabric. A Ranger tab. Below it, catching what little light existed in the dim room, was a badge. Tarnished. Worn smooth by hands and time and desert sun. A combat badge. One specific badge. One she recognized. The badge from Kandahar. The oxygen monitor registered her sudden intake of breath, the audible gasp of someone recognizing a ghost they thought had stayed buried in sand 8,000 miles away. Katie's hand trembled. Just once. Just for a fraction of a second. Long enough for her body to betray her in the privacy of this dim room with no witnesses. Then she locked it down. Locked everything down. Jaw tight. Breath controlled. The box pressed back against her chest. But her eyes remained on that badge. Valkyrie. The word came from the bed. Not a question. A whisper, voice ragged from days of intubation, but absolutely certain. Katie's head turned slowly. The unconscious man's eyes were open. The monitors had registered the change before his body decided to cooperate, oxygen saturation ticking upward, heart rate climbing from the flat rhythm of sleep into something purposeful. His eyes found hers, dark and focused, and in them was the clarity of someone who had just come back from somewhere very far away. He stared at her for 3 seconds. Long enough for Katie to see the recognition there. Long enough for her to see the moment he knew. Valkyrie, he whispered again, and this time it was a confirmation. A declaration. A single word that contained 8 years of history, of trust, of having watched this woman perform miracles in a forward operating base while rockets screamed overhead. Katie opened her mouth. Closed it. Not a single word emerged. Her composure was steel, her expression absolutely neutral, but her hands gripped the cardboard box so hard the edges began to buckle. The man's eyes moved past her. Katie felt a presence in the doorway. Her daughter. Sarah had insisted on coming with her to collect her things. She stood frozen in the entrance, eyes moving from the patient to the boots to Katie's face, and Katie watched the moment understanding struck her daughter like an electrical current. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Sarah said quietly. Not a question. Not an introduction. A statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had haunted her entire childhood, all those phone calls Katie refused to take, all those late nights staring at nothing, all those scars that had never quite made sense on a hospital nurse. The silence that followed was so complete the ventilator sounded like it was running inside Katie's own chest. A figure appeared beside Sarah. A Navy SEAL, his bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes, the way he moved, the way his eyes catalogued the room in a single sweep, the way his hand rested near his jacket pocket with the practiced readiness of someone trained for violence. He was holding a file. Official. Bound in red tape. When he stepped into the room, his hands were trembling. Senior Chief Rodriguez. His voice was controlled, military trained, but the tremor in his hands told a different story. He opened the file with deliberate precision. Katie watched the pages like she was watching a slow-motion video of her own drowning. The individual in this bed triggered a federal protection protocol the moment his combat badge was photographed during hospital intake. His badge initiated a classified scan that was automatically cross-referenced with active JSOC operations. You have 2 silver stars. The SEAL paused. Blinked. Read again like he couldn't quite believe the words on the page. 2 silver stars for actions in Kandahar province. Katie's daughter reached out and took her mother's hand. Just like that. Held it. Squeezed it. 3 bronze stars with Valor, the SEAL continued, his voice dropping lower. And a Navy Cross. The citation cites your actions during the ambush on the Sanjin Valley resupply convoy. 47 personnel under fire. You maintained a field medical station for 73 minutes under active mortar rounds. You personally treated 31 combatants and 15 civilians. The room was very quiet now. And a Navy Cross, the SEAL finished, the words arriving like a benediction and a condemnation all at once. The door to the corridor opened again. This time it was someone Katie had never seen before. A woman in her 50s, wearing the kind of suit that announced Pentagon authority before she ever spoke a word. Her credentials read Deputy Director, Special Operations Medical Coordination, and when she walked into that room, the seal straightened automatically, his military bearing responding to the chain of command before his conscious mind caught up. Senior Chief Rodriguez, the woman said, and there was respect in her voice, the kind of respect that couldn't be faked, that came from knowing exactly what someone's decorations meant. We need to discuss the operative in this bed. His identity triggered a federal investigation the moment his badge was uploaded to the hospital records system. The FBI has been monitoring this case for 9 days. What we discovered is why Dr. Sterling attempted to have you terminated. Katie's jaw tightened. Just a millimeter. Just enough. Dr. Sterling attempted to alter your personnel file, the woman continued. To add fraudulent performance complaints. To justify your removal from this facility. We have emails. We have phone records of him contacting your previous references requesting they modify their statements. We have a pattern of deliberate obstruction of this federal investigation spanning 48 hours of active pursuit of your dismissal. The woman produced a tablet. On the screen were documents, Katie's personnel file, but the entries looked wrong. Different. Words she'd never seen before in spaces that should have been blank. Timestamps. Email chains. Phone logs. Dr. Sterling's name appearing over and over, circling, pushing, demanding, threatening. Obstruction of a federal investigation, the woman said quietly. Falsifying medical records. Attempting to interfere with the medical care of an operative under active protection. Those are the charges. The next thing Katie heard was the sound of boots on tile. Heavy boots. Multiple pairs. Moving with purpose. The SEAL stepped aside, and 2 FBI agents entered the room, their movements calm and professional and utterly inevitable. They moved past Katie like she was part of the furniture, past her daughter, past the patient lying unconscious again, because he hadn't been unconscious, Katie realized. He'd been listening. Had been awake. Had heard every word. The agents continued down the corridor. Toward the administrative section. Toward Sterling's office. The next voice Katie heard was Sterling's, rising from somewhere beyond her line of sight. A shout. This is insane, I was protecting patient safety. His voice had lost its arrogance, replaced by something else. Desperation. Raw panic. The sound of someone watching their entire world come apart in real time. Katie walked toward the noise. Not running. Not hurrying. Just walking with the same methodical precision she'd used to perform a needle decompression while an operating room full of residents watched in stunned silence. Her daughter followed. Sarah's hand was still holding hers. The touch grounded her in a way nothing else could. The hallway corridor near Sterling's office had become a theater. The FBI agents had him now, and they were reading him his rights with the kind of clinical detachment that made the words sound even more damning. Sterling's face was red. Rage mixed with fear mixed with the desperate understanding that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. He was reaching for his phone when one of the agents caught his wrist. I didn't, you can't prove, he started, but the Pentagon woman had already produced the tablet. She turned the screen so everyone could see. Email timestamps. Doctored documents. Photographs of Sterling's laptop showing the exact moment he'd modified Katie's file. Phone records with location data proving he'd made calls to her previous employers from his office at 2:19 a.m. on 3 separate nights. You interfered with the medical care of a federal operative under active protection, the agent said. Her voice was flat. You attempted to remove the one person in this facility with the classification clearance and combat medical experience to recognize his identity. The cuffs clicked around Sterling's wrists. Not rough. Not dramatic. Just final. Residents had begun gathering. Some of the same faces who'd stood in uncomfortable silence while Sterling had thrown patient charts at Katie's feet. Who'd watched him dump her lunch tray on the floor. Who'd heard him call her timid. Small. Just a nurse. Their phones rose. Recording. Capturing the moment Dr. Sterling's authority transformed into handcuffed desperation. He was led down the corridor. Past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her tray to the floor. Past the conference room where he'd made his public bet that she'd quit within a week. Past the corner where he'd thrown the charts and ordered her to pick them up with that smile that had contained contempt and certainty in equal measure. The perp walk continued through the ER. News cameras flashed outside. Someone had tipped the media, probably someone inside the hospital who'd heard the rumors, who'd figured out what was happening. The federal vehicle was waiting at the curb, lights off but engine running. Sterling was guided into the back seat with professional efficiency. His hospital badge was still clipped to his chest, his white coat still buttoned, his entire professional identity still intact and yet utterly demolished in the span of 12 minutes. Katie watched from inside the ER doors. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge his gaze when his eyes found hers one last time through the car window. She simply stood there, her composure absolute, her expression unchanged, and when he looked away first, when his shame finally forced him to look somewhere else, she had already turned back toward the ICU. 2 years later, Katie Rodriguez stood in an office on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart Hospital, her name on the door with her full rank and decorations listed beneath in white letters, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, Director of Veteran Trauma Programs. The office was organized with military precision, but on the walls hung photographs. A platoon in Kandahar. A forward operating base Sunrise. Her daughter in the hospital volunteer uniform, smiling in a way that said she'd finally stopped asking questions and started understanding answers. The program she'd built treated 60 combat veterans monthly. 3 former military medics she'd personally recruited worked the trauma bays. They knew how to treat the kinds of injuries that came with classified operations. They knew how to ask the right questions without asking the wrong ones. They knew that healing sometimes meant silence. Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification courses at a community college 30 miles outside the city, making minimum wage, his medical license suspended indefinitely. His name appeared in hospital administration seminars as a cautionary tale. When competence becomes arrogance. That's what the seminar was called. The irony was so complete Katie almost smiled whenever she thought about it. But the smile never quite made it to her face. On her office wall hung a shadow box. Behind glass sat a pair of worn combat boots, a ranger tab, and a single combat badge. The badge from Kandahar. The one that had brought her back from the shadows. Every time Katie passed it, she touched the frame. Just her fingertips. Just for a moment. Just enough to remember that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. On a Wednesday afternoon, Katie conducted training for new hires in the same conference room where Sterling once held court. 30 nurses sat in rows, their attention absolute. She was teaching needle decompression protocols. Tension pneumothorax recognition. The kind of skills that saved lives when there wasn't time for hesitation. "You move here," Katie said, pointing to the exact location on the practice mannequin. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You don't second-guess. You don't call for approval. You act." Her voice was quiet. Commanding. Nothing like the timid nurse Sterling had mocked. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need compassion. You need training. And you need the courage to act when everyone else is frozen. The nurses filed out 20 minutes later, energized and focused. Katie remained in the room, straightening the folding chairs with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same lights that had witnessed her humiliation now illuminating her triumph. She touched the shadow box on her way out, her fingers tracing the outline of the combat badge, and returned to work, where 30 combat veterans were waiting, and where she was finally, completely home. If you've made it this far, you understand what it means to be underestimated. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because the next time you see someone being dismissed, you might just be watching someone with a Navy Cross pick up the pieces. Like this video, Comment with your take on Sterling's punishment, and let me know, if the Pentagon knocked on your workplace door tomorrow, would you step into the light?